Good afternoon, everybody. This is Peter. Welcome to the February 24th weekly radio address. I apologize to inform that this address will only be 1 hour in length. I'm getting inundated with obligations as I approach Zeitgeist Day in New York, so I'm having to skip out to do some test things for that. So I am going to answer your questions and go over some other things that I have on my list. And the first of which is the fact that I want to thank everybody for what they've done with Zeitgeist Day thus far. We have, I think, about 3 more weeks to go, and there's 253 events. About 97% of those have been approved, which is fantastic. I think we'll probably hit the 300 mark before the event actually pops up, and that's wonderful. I think it's going to be really exciting. I have a lot of interesting ideas of interlinking the events. Oh, and by the way, thank you for the promos, that were sent to me as a my request last week. I'm going to be posting those hopefully within the next few days, get someone to post those. I've been able to look through some of them, and it's a lot of fun to see what everyone's doing. I think it has a good effect in the YouTube culture when you do these searches for Zeitgeist Day and you get this whole slew of results. So thank you for doing that. I'm also going to be posting the program for the Zeitgeist Day event in New York City. There will be multiple web streams of this. We've always had integrity problems with our web streams for some reason, probably because we use free services that really can't handle the bandwidth, and often there are other problems as well. But nevertheless, the program will be posted. Again, it is a 6-hour event, so having this live, and of course, everyone out there who has Z-Day events that are close in time proximity as far as time zone, you're welcome to stream the event that we're doing live as well. And that's kind of why I'm organizing it the way I am. But more information on that will be coming forward as it develops. And let's see here. I wanted to talk about the phases of the movement. This is something I haven't talked about very often because it's again, we're in our infancy right now, and I don't want to throw too much information out there, throw too many ideas out there at this stage, because it might get people on the wrong track and people might jump the gun with certain things. But I've noticed a general frustration amongst some people regarding what to do and not quite understanding, what we're doing in effect as far as the process. So let me describe the 3 phases as I see it. This, of course, is subject to change. We can't predict the future, but this is the basic rundown of the way I see things unfolding over the course of the next few years. Phase 1 is an awareness phase, if you will. It's about collecting people, getting the information out there, finding identification with other groups and individuals across all races, religions, and ethnicities, then forming these teams that we have. The teams are in development. They have been a little bit stagnant because of basically a lack of personnel at this stage, but the ideas are solid, and it's just the beginning of the team formations. Most of our teams, as of right now, are related to infrastructure, if you will, of the movement site. And of course, there's communication teams. We have a powerful development team that has a lot of wonderful people in it that's doing good stuff. I'm hoping to be able to have more focus on these teams as we move forward. The real focus, though, has been the chapters, and that's what I've been working on mostly, is getting solid chapters internationally set up, basically creating the infrastructure, if you will, for communication on a global level. That's phase 1. That's simple enough, and that's the phase that we're in right now, even though we're leaking, if you will, we're bleeding over into phase 2. Phase 2 is the project phase, and this is where real action comes forward with the communications teams and all the teams. This is where this is where projects associated with individual chapters are utilized and shared with the rest of the international community. This is where action starts to materialize when we feel that when there's a collective understanding that we're synchronized with our approach, when people have really digested the material, when people have absorbed it, and there's enough people out there that really know what they're doing, really know what they're talking about when they give lectures, that there's a confidence in the information not being misconstrued and not running off into something incorrect. A classic example of a mistake that it keeps continually occurring with this idea of a resource-based economy is that there could be just a resource-based economy city or a resource-based economy society. While those abstractions might have their place, that isn't what the focus of the movement is. That isn't what Jacques Fresco and the Venus Project have been talking about for so long. That isn't where the logic lies. The logic lies in fact, the most difficult approach, which is the global revolution, if you will, the global in statement of a resource-based economy, which by definition is the only type of resource-based economy you could possibly have if you were to adhere to the points that we're talking about. It has to be global. So phase 2 is about putting things in action, which are basically awareness projects, of course, but they're more organized. They're actually doing something. Some of them might even resolve certain issues. We might have offshoots, if you will, that approach specific areas. For example, there's a project now regarding world hunger and a way to, almost a promotion for the movement to show that, yes, world hunger can be solved. We might move into disarmament projects, anti-militarism projects. This is where phase 2 comes into play. It's basically an expansion of the teams, expansion of the group focuses, and basically making an organization as such through the interconnection of these different groups with interrelated focuses. Interdisciplinary is a good word. Phase 3 is where things get very serious, and we're very much far from phase 3, unfortunately. This is an action phase. This is where higher forms of activism and boycotts would emerge. This is where fundraising would emerge for city construction. This is where very direct lobbying of different corporate and political organizations would occur. This is where things become dynamic in the interaction with previously established institutions. Those are the fundamental 3 phases that I'm willing to denote right now. And there's a ton that can go into each one of these. But I want to remind everybody that we have to get the infrastructure and awareness phase and the fundamental level down. We need enough members to make our existence seem relevant to the external world. And that's what everybody should be doing. I'm really hoping that everyone can find balance out there that feel frustrated, that they say, oh, I'm really inspired by this, I want to do something, but what do? They come to the site and they don't quite know, they don't see as much activity, they join a chapter, but the chapter is sort of immobile because they haven't quite gotten their own infrastructure together as far as how it relates to their environment. Obviously, each chapter is going to have different actions related to what happens in their environment. That's going to be for another level of awareness. That's more of a phase 2 issue, though. But nevertheless, we have to kind of relax a little bit and understand that this is about making the awareness spread as far as possible in a very general sense, to get people to understand, to identify with it, and then to want to help. And the more people that want to help literally moves us into phase 2. And it will become self-evident when that occurs. And we already are in phase 2 to a certain degree, as I said, but we're in between. And I just want to make that very clear. I also want to address the notion of how people get involved in general. The way the architecture is of the movement, which again is not materialized yet because we're in this preliminary phase, I will state again the movement isn't functional in my mind. While there's some great general awarenesses, flash mobs, and things going on, it's not functional in any real capacity, and it really can't be until there's better organization, which is facilitated by more focused people and more central organizers to come to the front, to have the time to do so. We're really walking against the grain here. I have a deep respect for all of you out there, the handful of you that have been able to tolerate the tensions that have arisen because of the way we're doing things, while you also have a day job and everything else. We're not accepting funding for this. Everyone out there needs to have a tremendous respect for those that are actually working directly in the movement, including the moderators and admins, the team heads, the chapter heads. Everyone that has a chapter, these people are taking a lot of time out of their normal lives, depriving themselves of what is the basic motivation in this culture, which is monetary acquisition. It's a very difficult thing that we're trying to do, and I really hope that people fully grasp the focus and intent and dedication of those that are serving to carve out this movement for what it is. It goes way beyond myself. But regarding the issue of how to get involved and what the architecture is of the way the movement's constructed, it's a bottom-up approach. It's a reverse hierarchy. We're not there yet, unfortunately, though. And what that means is that there are teams and there are sub-teams. Sub-teams focus on specific areas, and they reach consensus amongst themselves regarding certain directions. That information is spread up to the next level, which the heads of the teams themselves. And it moves up the ladder until it comes to what will eventually be a oversight board, an international board of the entire Zeitgeist movement, if necessary, by the way. Not all actions of the movement have to be approved by anybody. Chapters have their own world to a certain degree, but it's great to know what everyone's doing so there can be better organization globally. The only way effective mobilization will occur is if it's global, meaning when there's an action that has to be taken in the future, it's not just going to be restricted. Well, there might be cases where it's restricted to one area in the sense of civil liberties and certain countries being farther back than others. Yes, that's obviously relevant. But when it comes to larger order global protests, if you will, the only way it's going to make a real effect is if it's truly global, meaning there has to be an oversight organization to do so. So eventually there will be a Zeitgeist Movement Oversight Board, which is an international council which will most likely be a collection of individuals that range across the globe and are directly affiliated with the chapters themselves. So all organizers of their chapters, the ones that have started these chapters in their regions and have created their teams, these are the first to be looked upon as to join the oversight board. Now, a lot of people out there will hear something like that and they think, well, that sort of sounds like what we have today, a sort of a hierarchy at the top. And who are these oversight people? Are we going to elect them into power? There's the notion of democracy. There's all these outmoded projections that come into play. There's all these outmoded value systems that come into play. And it's really unfortunate and it's very difficult to address because of the projections that happen emotionally. The notion of democracy, I'll jump on that one. Democracy is 7 white people hanging a black person. That's what democracy is. Democracy has to come from the actual tangible information. It can't come from the arbitrary assumption that everyone in society is educated enough to make decisions about what's actually relevant. Obviously, if you look at the public at large today, we know democracy is a failure because virtually no one, of course I say no one as an extreme way to point this out, but virtually no one really understands how society operates and how it should work on a technical level. So true democracy to me is really the way that Wikipedia is organized. It's about information being put into a system with a system of cross-checking through peers, if you will. I think Wikipedia is quite amazing. There are, of course, problems with it, but I think the last analysis of it was a 94% accuracy rate of an encyclopedia created by the public. I think that's very powerful, and that's the exact logic I'm carrying over into the From Earth to Venus project, which is eventually going to be the model, if you will, of how interaction unfolds in a society. Well, I hate to say that in a resource-based economy, but because that's too, I can't tell you how that's going to unfold in the exact terms, but what I can say is that the way the From Earth to Venus project is organized, we have different people putting in different information. We have conclusions arrived at by the statistical and fact-based information that's presented. This is eventually how society will be organized. If you read Jacques' book, he talks about this. Eventually, it will be interactions with intelligent databases that can feed back respectively without the projections and value system distortions that we see today in the decision-making processes of government. I know that's a mouthful to throw out there, but I want everyone to begin to understand that democracy of the future, and hopefully democracy in the sense of the way we organize the Zeitgeist Movement, is a matter of contributing information. It's not a matter of certain people being elected to any position or anything like that. We bring people to the forefront that have the most to contribute. And that is the architecture that we're working on. And as I said, it's a reverse hierarchy. It goes from the sub-teams to the teams to the larger overarching, and then the decisions are made from the bottom up. It's a difficult thing to do because on multiple levels, our infrastructure technologically doesn't allow for such things. So there's new developmental programs I have in the back of my mind which will assist in these ideas. But I think that's a basic overview of the way things are constructed. So if anyone out there, in other words, who says, well, how do I get involved? The best thing to do is to join a team and then to start working with the teams. And again, I know the teams have not been very active in any extremely liberal way, but we're getting there. We're still in that phase. So that's what I'd like to say about that. And yeah, I think that's just about it. I'm going to go into your questions. One moment. Okay, question 1. I think I actually already just addressed that. I'll read it anyway. Some of the more technically inclined members of the movement seem to feel as if they have little direction. I'm talking about some of the engineers and scientists I've seen on the forums who don't feel their value is in spreading the word as much as starting to work out the technical aspects of what we are trying to do. I know we aren't building a city yet, but I think it would be wise to organize more efficiently and recognize these kinds of talents because in the end, these people are the ones who need to build and design cities. I couldn't agree more. There will then eventually be an energy team. There will eventually be a city planning team. These are things that happen in the works, but we don't have the resources to move forward. We live in a monetary system. We're not in a position to take donations yet. So these aspects, while very, very important, are not what our focus is at this stage. However, we do have the Science and Technology Forum. We do have the creative team, which again will be locked into the From Earth to Venus project website, which is in development. And that will be a good place to share ideas, to provide statistical information, to think about infrastructure, and to do what scientists and technicians are there to do. So we're doing our best. It's just not that phase yet. Generally speaking, though, there's a great deal of communication that can be done if you are in a position of research in a technological field. This is the type of stuff that we need to hear about. That should be spread on the website, on the forum. It should be spread if you have a chapter, you send out emails. It could be done that way. We need to keep society up to date about what's actually going on, and who best to do that than those that actually work in the fields that represent these issues. So, for example, if anybody out there works in nanotechnology, I am nothing but astounded at the possibilities of nanotechnology and how it will change this planet. So essentially, if that's where your medium is, that would be a fantastic place for you to spread more information about. Again, I love to see collaboration on a higher scale and a team format of architects, engineers, and everything else. It's just there's not much they can move forward with right now because we don't have the resources to do anything. Number 2. Hi, Peter. You've answered literally hundreds of questions on the radio address. So at the main NYC event, will there be a Q&A? And if you are devoting time to a Q&A, then are you expecting the questions to pertain to new information and material that will be presented? There's always going to be a Q&A at these events. I think it's important. Honestly, questions and answers is how we progress. So people that ask questions are how new ideas come up. We all have different life experiences. So even though I know I've answered a lot of the same questions, I tend to find people ask the same questions coming from different angles. So given that, I have a great deal of respect for anyone's questions, even though you'll notice I skip questions that I feel are not tangible or might be super redundant, mainly because I'm locked into a specific time frame for this radio show, so I just kind of have to operate like that. And I apologize if someone really wants their question answered, go to the new forum that's created for the Q&A for the radio show and say, you skipped my question last time, I really wish you'd answer this question, and I'll answer it. That's fine. I just think some people come to the forum without reviewing any information, and I don't want to waste a lot of people's time with questions that have already been answered. But back to your point, yes, NYC event will be big on questions. In fact, it'll be kind of a town hall kind of question and answer thing. That's why I allocated 6 hours for it. I'm expecting at least an hour and a half to 2 hours of just questions. Last year we had an hour of questions, and there were still lines and lines of people that were very frustrated that they couldn't ask a question, which is one of the reasons why I've extended this event, and to give it more of a community environment. Number 3, hey Peter, I was wondering if you had heard of Robert Steele. He is currently a clandestine intelligence case officer who has chosen to focus on a project he calls Earth Intelligence Network and Open Source Intelligence Systems powered by the bottom up by people, mostly volunteers, who agree to share information in a structured way regarding to all topics. I am familiar with Robert Steele, but I unfortunately haven't had a chance to look into exactly what his network is doing, even though I know the gist of it. But I'm certainly intrigued by it, and I like everything I've heard. So I'm going to circle that and look into that. Number 4. Hi, Peter. I was wondering, what do you think of the idea of each Zeitgeist chapter arrange the entire chapter to volunteer for charities, and subtly push the charities into providing much-needed infrastructure in poor communities that would provide the basic necessities such as food, water, medicine, etc. I think that through this, the Zeitgeist Movement will not only help people during the transition, but will also improve its image, thus making it easier and spreading awareness. I think that's a beautiful idea. The Zeitgeist Movement at this stage, however, doesn't really operate as a charity. It's a social awareness movement at this stage. I would love to see, Zeitgeist-related charity organizations in the future. This could be part of the Phase 2, Phase 3 transitional systems, as Jacques has talked about. You can extrude highly dense, nutritious food. You can create a factory to do this, along with desalinization plants incorporated. This would be programs for the transition to feed all the starving in Africa and South America and the like. That would be wonderful. At this stage, I wish I had the ability to move forward with something like that, but we don't have the resources to do so. I'm certainly not going to poo-poo anything like that. I'm certainly not going to. If any chapter out there has the financial resources to do something like that for their local community, that's great. But again, I have to draw the line at these chapter organizations moving in with money. As with all charity organizations, if you look back into their financial statements and you look at who gets paid what, the bureaucracy tends to persist and an establishment is created. So those are the general fears, but it doesn't have to go that far. And overall, I think it's a great idea. It's just not something I'm going to personally say sanction towards everyone, say go out and start feeding people. It isn't really what the movement represents, even though it's a beautiful idea. Number 5. You often state how the scientific method is unbiased, but there are a few subjects where there is still controversy in science. There still is controversy in science. In things like global warming, I'm sure the controversy is monetary related. However, in cases like abortion, it seems like there is real controversy. So I would have to ask, in a resource-based economy, would abortion be allowed, and how would scientists come to this conclusion? A very, very complex question. A scientific method is a methodology. It doesn't suppose bias or unbias. I'm sure through time there will be improvements to methodology far exceeding what we think today. Scientific method is essentially based on testing and hypotheses and logical reasoning. The reason you test things in the scientific method is to discount for the problems in human rational thought. People can grow up thinking that water puts out fire, and then they go up to a tree that's on fire, they dump water on it, and then they see a fire that's a chemical fire, which is, say, an oil slick fire, and they throw water on it, and it does nothing but spread the oil. You don't throw water on an oil fire, in other words, unless it's like a huge amount, but nevertheless, that's not the way you think about things in that regard. So that's why you have to test things. Regarding the relationship to abortion, well, that's a really complex one because it's really a value relationship, and it's a very complex one. If I was to give a logical unfolding of that, I would have to say that really it's the mother that has the responsibility in the decision-making processes. The gray area emerges from the moment of conception. Is it a person, or is it a person then, or is it a person when the child is born? Obviously, it's not a healthy thing for a child to be aborted. There's been plenty of cases where there's adverse reactions to stuff like that. But, you have to weigh the variables. It's not a clean-cut issue. In a resource-based economy, such freedoms would be allowed. There's no reason otherwise. There's a degree of aberrancy, a judgment of aberrancy after a certain point, which is culturally defined. And there's still a value issue. There's still a goal-oriented value association. In a resource-based economy, it's pro-human, if you will. And with, of course, the awareness that the environment supports humanity, therefore our care as the human species is engulfed into the environment around us. But we aren't there to save every species. We aren't there to be humanist in an abstract sense. Humanism itself is a limited construct ideologically. We're not humanists. It's about the survival of the species and maintaining harmony of the species with the natural world. So all I could really say without giving any other long-winded treatments on the notion of abortion is that it really, in the initial stages, which makes the other stages seem almost arbitrary, but again, it's arguable based on collective value associations, it's the decision of the mother and nothing more. I don't see how anyone can argue otherwise without being absolutely irrational. The religious community seems to believe that, life begins at conception. Some of them believe this. When it's also documented that even conceived fetuses are released through menstruation. So I think there was an old George Carlin joke that any woman that's had multiple periods is a serial killer in the eyes of the religious community. So it's a very complex value system problem. I think allowing the freedom to really restrict how many humans can come on this planet in the sense of if a family can't support their child, then they shouldn't bring in another one. If they can't support themselves, then it's utterly illogical, and it's really going to hurt society for them to bring in another child when society can't support it, when they can't support it. So anyway, I'm not even going to go on any of those tangents. Hopefully my disposition is clear. Again, it's not black and white, but I think when it comes to the fact of ownership in an abstract sense. Your fingers are basically yours. It's sort of a common thing where your body parts are essentially yours. Same thing goes for a fetus in utero. Number 6, I'm looking to give lectures on the movement to other activist groups in the future in an attempt to find common ground and bring these groups together to work towards a common goal. One of these groups is Transition Towns, which primarily advocates working towards sustainable living on a local scale without fossil fuels, etc. A question I'm expecting is, why can't we just focus on being sustainable on a local level, unquote? Working towards a global system is too radical. Our focus needs to be local. While I have thought of several ways to answer this question, I would like your thoughts on why this can't be the end solution to our current problems. Well, I think I stated that earlier in the broadcast. While I am an absolute advocation of sustainable living, which should be completely clear, and I am in awe of all of these wonderful organizations like Transition Towns and Earthships that have this lo-fi way of making communities that are self-sustaining, you have to ask yourself the question, are these communities going to be sustainable on a global level? Is that where you want things to work? As a transition for helping people, that's fine, but we are going to have to rely on a relatively high-tech form of environment if we expect to feed and clothe all the people on this planet. That's really what we've created with the population explosion, with the powerful use of energy. While there is going to be a time, I think, when energy starts to reduce unless serious changes are made, and such transition towns, I think, will be viable, I think the larger goal still has to be clear, and that is we need a total global revision. We don't want any more patchwork, but I'm certainly not going to stop anyone from these advocations. I just want to make sure my job is to make sure we have the broadest vision that we have. Everything that happens in between is great to a certain degree. But once we lean back and say, okay, we're just going to build a city, and it's going to be a fresco city, and we're all just going to live there and be happy and ignore the rest of the planet, then there's a serious problem, and it's not going to be productive at all. Number 7. My question is about education in the future. How will education in a resource-based economy be? One of the goals of a resource-based economy is to maximize the efficiency of machines and technology. Will advanced machines take over the work of teachers? What if that's the case? Don't you think that humans need some kind of attachment or touch with another human being in order to learn new things better instead of with the machine? Or will the whole concept of education in the future be entirely different from what it is today? Good question. I would have to say that education in the future, I think, will be radically different than what we see with a bunch of kids locked into a classroom listening to a teacher talk. I think there'll be much more interaction with computer databases. I really think the method of problem solving in the future will come from interaction with database machines that can see far beyond the 5 sense and cognitive reality of the human being. I think it's going to have to be that way. This is why the work of Ray Kurzweil is so controversial. I'm not a big on transhumanism or anything, but he does make a very valid point that by around 2029, all indicators point to the fact that machine intelligence will exceed human intelligence in almost every way. So rather than fear that, rather than have to jostle for jobs, by the way, and just to throw this out there, by that point, the cost of this technology will be so, if we still have a market system, and there's tons of things that could happen in that time, but let's assume that things are the same. The cost of the machines capable of running processes that humans currently do in the labor force will be so cheap that it will make humans absolutely obsolete, and I've made that point before as far as the future of technological unemployment. So education in the future obviously will most likely not be based on specialization in the way we see today. It will be based on problem solving and finding the best way to get each child, even adults, in fact, education should be considered a lifelong process. It doesn't necessarily even have to exist in classrooms whatsoever. It doesn't have to be mandated by anything. It's a value system orientation, adaptation, where children, as they always do, have a curiosity to learn. It's only when they're oppressed that children decide that they don't like to learn anymore. It's only when learning becomes a chore, and learning should never be a chore. I really couldn't tell you. This is a Jacques Fresco question, and if I was to repeat what Jacques had said before, I would say that, the example he provides of putting children into a problem-solving environment where they learn to work together. Education is really about values more than anything else. It's not about learning 1 + 1 = 2 per se. It's about making a cultural balance that is shared. It's about creating cultural balance, cultural ideals that are shared by everyone, therefore reducing all the conflict. It's about eliminating the need for jealousy. It's about eliminating all of the ego issues that tend to influence people into aberrated behavior. I think I don't have the book in front of me, but there's a great researcher at Harvard that I've been researching who's been talking about the prison system and violence, and his I'll bring it on next show. Anyway, his realization is that the reason there's so much violence is really it's obviously a values issue, but it's an educational issue ultimately. These people are never given the tools to solve their problems. And this is the central focus of education. It isn't 1 + 1 = 2. Of course, that's going to be a big part of it. It's about getting people to learn how to interact correctly with each other and cooperate. This is absent in our current educational system. There's no focus on cooperation in any real sense. In fact, the very basis of taking a test is you competing with everyone else. Someone gets an A, someone gets an F, someone gets a little star because they get the A, and you get ostracized and a letter sent home to your parents because you got an F. All it does is create more and more division in the current methods. But anyway, I couldn't tell you exactly how it's going to unfold in the distant future, but I think much more focus will be on children initially learning how to engage conflicts in a personal level. And then I think the next level would be science, technology, and all the things that we talk about, logical reasoning. People should be studying reasoning and logical processes at the earliest stage. Anyway, I think if you think about it cleanly, you'll see that education stems from education is essentially behavior. People behave based on the way they're educated for the most part. There's obviously genetic aspects that accelerate or deaccelerate certain tendencies, propensities that are created by serotonin and testosterone. But education is about behavior. You want to get people to behave in a constructive and civilized manner, you have to educate them to do so, and our educational system does the exact opposite. Number 8, this question quite lingers in my mind for a while. Assuming that the monetary system collapsed and people had built a resource-based global economy, what will happen to people that had already been conditioned with greedy, aberrant behavior like the corporatocracy? They list a bunch of institutions that are not actually related to that per se, but I didn't know what he's saying. The aberrant behavior like, people of heavy greed in the Trilateral Commission or those that have dominance positions, sure. He continues, I want to ask if these groups of people will continue their greedy mentality in a resource-based economy, or would they start to behave in a just manner? We have to ask yourself the question again, back to my prior point, why do they behave the way they do? If your society rewards your self-seeking, non-altruistic, selfish, groupistic, cliquistic, elitist mentality, which this system does, if that's what's rewarded by society, then that's what will be pursued. It's that simple. It has no morality, philosophy you can throw out the window. If whatever the society rewards is what people will engage in. That's why you're never going to see an end of monetary corruption. In fact, as the system begins to collapse, you're just going to see more and more rampant corruption and money grabbing from CEOs that know they only have 2 years in their existence as a CEO, so they're not going to give a damn when they pollute the Amazon rainforest, when they're doing deforestation or anything. So these people have to be turned around, if you will. That's really what it comes down to. So their behavior is contingent upon what the society enforces, what the society rewards. Our society rewards corruption, period. It doesn't reward altruism. It does not reward people with ingenious, sustainable, abundance-creating ideologies. The market system is the driving value mentality. It's the value program. People have had chips put into their brain, if you will, that have programs that are orthodox theology of the monetary system, if you will. Sorry, this is a terrible analogy. But they are running their own programs, and they are sitting there behaving the way they're supposed to behave in this culture, which is behavior of indecent corruption and dishonesty. So the only thing that's going to turn these people around is a totally different social organization, just like with any human being. Number 9. Hello, Peter. My questions. What technologies, let me try to rephrase this. What technologies could be used besides nanotechnology to replicate scarce resources? What technologies could be used besides, what technology could be used besides nanotechnology to replicate scarce resources? The skeptical people keep coming up with the question of how we could handle distribution of really scarce resources, and they say that we need a price mechanism for such scarce resources, or otherwise the system is somehow magically going to fail because people would tear each other apart for scarce resources that they must have. The focus is not to restrict scarce resources, it's to find substitutes and reorganize the infrastructure so scarce resources are no longer scarce. That's the approach should be. The price mechanism does not do anything with scarce resources. All it does is restrict access. The idea that if you were to run out of gold on the planet and the price of gold goes up and up and up doesn't help anybody. All it means is that no one can access whatever gold might be left if gold hits, say, $1 million a pound. So that doesn't help anything. The price mechanism doesn't do anything for allocation. And the rich, obviously, are totally disproportionate. So even the richest people, the richest people will have access to those scarce resources. And that's, of course, a disposition of elitism. That's why elitism exists in the way it does, in part. So as far as your response to scarce resources, nanotechnology will help a lot with scarce resources. It's more of the approach of making sure that we have anticipated any scarce resources. This goes back to our central database program, the central nervous system for the planet. This is why it's so relevant, that we can see the trends emerge from the usage of resources. So if we see that, for example, we might run out of, oil, which we should be monitoring in a very dynamic way right now, which we're not, and all we have are falsified records coming from various organizations, this is where we monitor it and say, okay, we have this much time to go, and we're going to have to make strategic substitutions right now. Unfortunately, for many reasons, the price mechanism, in part, is what stops this obviously rational disposition from occurring, because far too much money will be made as we run out of oil by the elite, even though it breaks down society as we know it. So let me see if I've actually answered your question. How do we handle distribution of really scarce resources? Well, the first point is that we try to avoid it. We try to avoid it as much as possible. And then if there is such a scarce resource, it really comes down to what that resource is used for. In the event that something has to be created with a very scarce resource, well, there would have to be an awareness made to the public of the scarceness of that resource, and actions would be taken otherwise. I really have a hard time imagining something just not being available that everyone needs unless there's no foresight in regards to that problem. And on the molecular level, as you point out with nanotechnology, that will change just about everything. When we can deconstruct molecularly, when we can take atoms apart systematically and put them back together in formations, atomic formations that we need, that is going to really alter everything so dramatically that I don't even know where to begin. And it's another reason why the economic structure doesn't stand a chance. There's far too much efficiency on the horizon, if used for the right purposes, of course. I won't even go on the fact that nanotechnology equally offers a path of absolute destruction for humanity, but that goes with just about anything. As I said before, there was an old Carl Sagan quote where he said, "It's almost though there is a God, and he gives us atomic energy. You can either use it to power cities or for going to the moon, or you can use it to make weapons and kill yourself." This is where values come into play, which is why it's so critical that we work to educate the public into a new value system that's not based on the greedy, self-serving mechanisms that radiate from the individual to the business, to the city, to the state, to the country, to patriotism, to race, to everything else, and every other form of self-serving mechanism, a contrived, self-serving, individuated mechanism that I can come up with. Anyway, I'll stop that tangent. Number 10. Hold on a second. Has the Venus Project any ideas regarding energy production transport via ionosphere regarding Tesla? The ionosphere electrostatic form of energy has never been tested. God, it really just makes me angry that Wardenclyffe Tower was pulled before any of those processes could be put into place. It's still an experimental notion at this stage. The physics seem to support it. If you were to ask Jacques about that, he would say, I think that might be possible, but we don't even need it. And I agree with Jacques. There's plenty in a systems approach to energy management with renewables that we have, with solar panels that can take in 96%, with new technologies for infrared being taken in, which means you can take in energy at nighttime from the sun. we're going to have so much energy we won't even know what to do with it. Jacques has no problem with there being what he considers to be nearly endless forms of energy. That doesn't mean conservation isn't going to be utilized. All those things are inherent. Conservation and efficiency will equal the abundance, in fact. But as far as the ionosphere, I wish someone had a budget to put one of those up. I'd love to see if that's actually possible. If you further his train of thought with that, you'd have free energy coming from the ionosphere, traveling through the ionosphere wirelessly, and you just build essentially antennas in different areas that would pull this energy into different households, making absolutely free access to wireless energy. The energy from the ionosphere, of course, comes from the sun, which I think actually almost all energy, except from gravitational pulls, is really sparked by the sun. But okay, number 11. While spreading the ideas of the movement, I have found that my biggest difficulty is in describing the feasibility of a global transition to a resource-based economy. Some arguments I get are, do you think you will ever convince the billions of religious people on the planet to join? If they don't join, if they don't join, do you think they will leave you alone? Interesting question. I have my own problems with this scenario. If there is a set amount of people we need to start building the social and physical new world we want to live in, how long do we wait? Some bizarre sentences here. Okay, as far as the religious argument, you know what, I don't know what to say. First of all, I extend religion to be economics. I extend religion to be everything outside any dogmatic ideology that is based in patterns that are seemingly immovable is essentially a theological or religious notion. So, but in your context of religion being Judeo-Christian Islamic theology, everything that we talk about puts into practice what these teachers of these religions say, in part. Obviously, there's, of course, lots of negative, violent things that are associated with these religions that are not always in the original text, but have been culminated through tradition. Hey, you know what? Religious people are still people. And if someone has to choose between eating or having a Bible, most people would put down their Bible and actually eat because they know that they can't eat their Bible. So I believe the biosocial pressures that will emerge in the future will be impressing enough that even those of the most traditionalized religious establishment will give in to the approach of science and management of society and the understanding that we need to take control of our resources and make them available to everyone and use a systems approach to maintain them and construct all of our resources systematically from these resources with constant monitoring with the highest possible efficiency we can come up with technologically. I don't see anything against religious thought in regards to that in general. So what are you going to do? I think they'll come around. And they're going to have to. Again, if these patterns continue as they are, there's nothing but serious forms of destitution on the way, in my perspective. Number 12. Hi, Peter. Your analysis of scarcity-based monetary systems is excellent, but what is your analysis of abundance-based monetary systems? That's a unique question. I don't know of any type of abundance-based monetary system. For there to be an abundance, you would need a monetary system. You could talk about credit systems and energy certificates and things that relate to technocracy, but abundance-based monetary systems, if you're dealing with money as an idea that's used for exchange and it culminated through labor for income, then you're not going to have an abundance-based monetary system. For none of it would make any sense. The system wouldn't work if there was an abundance. Defining abundance meaning that anybody has access to anything and it's an absolute abundance. There would be no point for it. So I'm not quite sure what you mean. Number 13. Hi, Peter. Thanks for taking time to address this. It is my understanding that due to the inherently corrupting properties of money, you do not feel it is possible for the Zeitgeist Movement to start or endorse nonprofit organizations or businesses. Well, that's not exactly true. I'm simply not starting a nonprofit myself. I don't see the necessity at this stage, in this phase, it's not that it's never going to happen, for money to be introduced. I think it will cause more problems than anything else. Throwing money at things doesn't necessarily help anything, as we should see from all of these other nonprofit institutions, from all of these foundations that exist. Money doesn't change anything necessarily. The ideas have to be firmly implanted, and we need the awareness there. Once again, we get into end of phase 2, into phase 3, then money will become an issue when we need access to resources to make tangible structures, or even events or fairs or projects, if you will, that require such income, not necessarily tangible structures. I was obviously referring to the city system. But let me continue with the question. You do not feel it's possible for the Zeitgeist Movement to start to endorse nonprofits or businesses. One, many of us feel that it should be theoretically possible to wean us off the monetary addiction in a structured fashion while providing essential needs. For example, a nonprofit organization to grow food for poor people. Would you reject the notion of possibilities beyond critical mass of awareness in terms of transition? Obviously, that's in later phases, but it's not what I think needs to be done right now, and not what Jacques and Roxanne think needs to be done right now. Even if I had a fundraising aspect to provide food for people, that while that's wonderful, there are other organizations that are doing that. That doesn't help anything. It's just another patchwork. It's just another organization doing the same thing that everyone else has been doing. Number 2, can you explain why the scientific method would not entertain the monetary system, possibly including businesses or NPOs, as tools or temporary resources to take proactive steps towards transition? Can you explain why not entertain the monetary system? Well, I think I already answered that question. Money will be used as a tool when there are larger order projects to work with. And again, we're not a charity. There might be offshoots that do have this element in later phases. But I want everyone to remember where we are right now. We have 370,000 subscribers. Only a fraction of them are actually really active. The general public is absolutely unaware of what we're doing. There are going to be more awareness events like Zeitgeist Day. There will be, in the future, Venus Project Symposium. We have this wonderful Venus Project tour that Jacques and Roxanne are going on, which I hope will really help with the global awareness. As the chapters emerge, more independent projects come forward. Until we see a satisfaction within the global community that things are actually being done and things are stabilized and there is a general identification with the direction. Again, I hate to say it, but I'd say 35% of the people I interact with so far in the history of this do not know what we're talking about. They really don't get it. They really don't understand the value issues. They really see this as another form of problem solving that is respective of other forms of institutions that have existed in the past. And that's not at all what this is about. Number 14. This continues with the prior question. Is it your opinion that no company, regardless of intent, can create a force for good and promote doing the right thing regardless of profitability? It is. I think intent can be very positive for a company, but good intent only happens after the money is absorbed and the institution is created and people are being paid. And essentially, if, say, an organization that is taking in lots of money for their direction, say something comes around and voids what that organization is doing. Say another organization completely overrides and says, okay, what you're doing is actually very much inefficient. The previous organization has an established structure that's monetarily based. While their intents might be great, there's plenty of organizations out there for profit, well, non-profit, but they still take profit, that have intents that do good in isolated pockets, which are mostly patchwork, but still it's good that people are doing something. They still have an establishment, and they still pay people. They still have employees. They still are a monetary creation. Therefore, the survival of many people is contingent upon them. That's exactly what I want to avoid in the Zeitgeist Movement. The moment I see people sitting back making money off of the movement in the sense that they're deeply involved and without the movement they wouldn't be able to survive is the moment that I think corruption will emerge. And while eventually something like that will probably work out in hybrid, I want to avoid that at all costs. And I know some people won't agree with me on that one. But again, when we have projects, then money is brought in. This is a volunteer organization. At this stage, who knows what the future could hold. I spend an outrageous amount of time doing things, so do a lot of people. And the real action isn't going to come from people taking in money and setting up, say, a homeless shelter or anything like that. Those are patches because they don't go after the root causes. Anyway, I'm going to stop belaboring that. Number 15, Peter, where are all the leading progressive intellectuals at? Where are all the leading progressive intellectuals at? Why isn't Michael Moore, Noam Chomsky, and others supporting the Venus Project? I don't understand it. Why is it that someone as me who who barely makes above minimum wage with only a high school education can see the beauty and possibility of the Venus Project's proposals, But these highly successful, highly educated progressives cannot. There's something not right here. Have you ever tried to contact anyone? Well, this goes back to my point on ideological establishments. Michael Moore is an ideological establishment. I have a great deal of respect for Moore, as I've stated before, but he has an ideological establishment. So does Noam Chomsky. Chomsky has a powerful ideological establishment. So let's assume that there are aspects of the Zeitgeist Movement that are contradictory of Moore's ideas of ethical, moral accountability and capitalism a love story. He does understand the system, he does understand the need, but he doesn't seem to follow through with it as far as the monetary system. I think he would find what we're talking about far too radical. I know other people have contacted him. As far as Noam Chomsky, he's sort of berated things casually. He never really looked into it. I don't know what to say. I mean, there's only so much energy I can personally spend on educating various personalities, but I'm less concerned with the major personalities than I am with up-and-comers. And what I mean by that is it's much easier to get through to people that do not have an ideological establishment already in place because their identification isn't locked in. So who knows? I don't rule anyone out. I would love to be able to talk to Michael Moore. I'd love for Michael Moore to make a film about Jacques and Roxanne. I mean, it could be powerful to get heavy individuals. It's a controversial association. We are seeking the removal of the monetary system. If you can find anyone out there that's a major celebrity, a major political figure, a major anything that's ever condoned that, and I'm sure there are a few out there, but really, take a look. Take a look at anyone out there that might talk about this. It's far too radical for them to even think about. Michael Moore is a multimillionaire. Noam Chomsky is probably not a multimillionaire, but I'm sure he's fairly well-to-do after all of his best-selling books. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I agree with your frustration, though. I've done everything I can, and we need to continue our educational campaign. And the more events we do, the more inclined these larger order individuals will be to say, wait a minute, you know what? I'm willing to risk my identity a little bit to be associated with this. I mean, in fact, I actually had some relatively, I'm not going to name any names, but I had some relatively powerful people that agreed with what we were doing, and I invited them to speak at Zeitgeist Day in New York. And the moment that invitation was made, they said, well, you know what? They said literally, I don't know if I can deal with the association, because they're afraid it will impede on their personal life. And of course, that's understandable in this culture. If, some radio talk show host comes on to Zeitgeist Day and speaks, and their corporate platform doesn't agree with what we say, they could lose their job. And these are real worries in this culture that we live in, unfortunately. Number 16. Hi, Peter. If you don't have time for these, I understand, but I hope you can get to some. Number 1, do you use the term culture interchangeably with structure? Well, I don't know if they'd be totally interchangeable, but I can relate structure to culture. Culture is multifaceted, of course. It's a large word, temporal in nature. Structure can relate to that. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip that. I'm not quite sure where your relevance is with that, so I could have some tangents. But number 2, do you think what we are working towards could run the risk of, no idea what that word is, or do you think it would be the exact opposite? I'm going to skip that one. Do you think that the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project is directly against social alienation? Well, again, you're dealing with some semantic issues there. Against social alienation? Well, yeah, I'd say we are against the concept of social alienation, but anytime you disagree with anyone, especially a group, you're going to be engaging in some form of alienation. That's what alienation is, essentially, in a general definition. So are we against it? Yeah, but are we going to put our tail between our legs and be patronizing to people? No. Number 17. Running out of time here. Hi, Peter. I was wondering about your stance on genetic manipulation. Our technology is processing at an impressive rate, and we will, if we don't already, possess the means to genetically alter human DNA to weed out negative human attributes and diseases. Do you think in the future genetic manipulation is an ethical thing to do, or do you think it will create more division and even translate into a genetics war? This goes back to my point on nanotechnology. All technological ideas that have been coming forward have advanced technological ideas have the possibility of doing extremely positive things and extremely detrimental things. And the more distorted we become through monetary self-preservation, with ego ramifications, with social distortions and cliques and the division of society, the higher probability things like genetic manipulation and nanotechnology will result in serious problems over solutions. Genetic engineering in and of itself is absolutely neutral. It's not against nature for us to understand what we are and to alter ourselves faster than evolution can account for. That isn't against nature in my mind. This is our creation. We are nature. So it really comes down to the intent and the value systems, and that's the problem. That is the problem. So if we have, say, a rich culture that can purchase modifications to their children in utero or soon after they're born, and they have perfect eyesight, they grow, and they live 150 years, while the poor culture cannot do this because they don't have any money, then you're going to see a disgusting break in the species, a form of elitism and class differentiation that you've never even imagined. That's the worst thing that could happen. Talk about inequality. Anyway, there's a lot of issues like that. In and of itself, it's neutral. It's just that you've got to get the value systems in line to be able to understand these issues. Hold on one moment here. I was checking something. Source. Power. Okay, there's 2 minutes left, and I want to quickly denote two technical things that have come up with some groups associated with the forum and the website in general that have problems with the way things are organized. I went into a lot of detail about the phases and the way the architecture of the movement is forming. But there's a group out there that seems to think that everything should be open source. I think this has been addressed before, and I want to point this out. We don't live in an open source world, unfortunately. While I am poetically inclined to want to do as much as I can to walk the walk, we can't turn everything on the Zeitgeist Movement and everything that we do over to open source, because there isn't the integrity of open source across all platforms with support that is required to do what we need to do. It's a rather juvenile idea to think that if we're open source with everything, that somehow that's going to make everything better. It isn't. Open source is a tremendous, powerful, wonderful concept. I'm all about it, but relating to open source, the Zeitgeist Movement has some interlinking element that's all defining, and that if we're not open source, then we're contradicting ourselves in terms is really a stretch. I hope everyone understands that. People still buy their computers. It only goes to a certain degree. I will state, however, that the more open source we can become, the better. I always review open source more than anything else. I wanted to point that out. And there's some other tensions that have arisen regarding banning on the forum site. And this is an unfortunate reality. When I first started the website, we didn't ban anybody. And then slowly we had lots of what we call trolls come into play that were there just for harassment. Of all the moderators we've ever had in this site, I would say that 90% of those moderators have left because of absolute frustration with the type of harassment they receive from users that aren't there to help anything. They're simply there to cause problems. Unfortunately, banning is a reality of the world we live in today, with the value systems that are distorted, that people come to the website just to harass people. And I'm sure many of you on the forum have seen this already. And it's an unfortunate reality. It's just like we still have to put people in prisons, and then during the transition there will still be security and police. But the goal is reversed. We don't want to create more security and police. We want to reduce all of these issues. So the issue of banning, I just wanted to bring that up in passing because people keep emailing about this, saying it's against the movement to ban people. In abstraction, I see the point, but you have to understand where we are at this point in time. So that's all I have time to say about that. There's only 13 seconds left. I'm not going to have any exit music on this. I'm just going to say good night and good luck. And I hope everyone does well. Goodbye.